Good morning, class of 2025. We're so happy to see you. Even if it's just the top half of your faces, we're so happy to see your faces. We're so happy that we can all be here together in person. To get this event started off, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our interim provost, Dr. Janet Lanahan. Please, everyone, let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Janet Lanahan.
Thanks, Kristen. I am so thrilled to be here and to welcome each of you to Hofstra University. We are so excited to have you on campus and as our newest members of the Pride. This is a particularly special event on our campus. The common reading serves to give you a taste of the kind of intellectual exploration and discussion you will encounter through your studies at Hofstra. The virtual panels you attended this summer were meant to provide a glimpse into the free exchange of ideas that is core to our value system at our university. Discussing various works from the 1619 projects shows you how much you can learn if you are willing to open your mind to understanding different perspectives. Today, information is at our fingertips, but true knowledge and understanding of that information requires a deliberate effort. As consumers of information, we need to forge beyond the algorithms that reinforces myopic views on important issues of the day, and instead develop our critical thinking to see through people's agendas and weigh all the evidence and opinions to formulate our own thoughts. The lens with which we digest information becomes the kaleidoscope of how we view the world. To be a critical thinker means you think deeply about issues, you question your own strongly held beliefs, you engage in meaningful discourse with those who may think differently, you value diversity of opinions and experiences, and most importantly, you have the courage to change. Hofstra University will offer you many opportunities to pursue knowledge in all its forms, from cultural events to student clubs to athletics. Take advantage of those opportunities and jump in. I'm sure you have heard the saying, you get out what you put in. Well, it is never more true than during your undergraduate college experience. Adopt a growth mindset. If you believe that you can develop new skills and talents, you are better able to focus your energy on learning. To do that, I would like to share a few tips that I have found served me well in my own educational journey. First, be a risk taker. Enroll in a class that is out of your comfort zone, one that will expand your thinking. It is often the introduction to a new field of study that sparks the next great idea. Famously, Steve Jobs, founder of Apple Computer, decided to enroll in a calligraphy class while he was at Reed College, with no knowledge of what it really was. And in that class, he was introduced to different typefaces and the art of arranging letters and texts. In a speech he delivered in 2005, he actually recalled that decision and remarked, and I quote, "If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would never have had the multiple typefaces or proportionately spaced fonts." Second, ask questions. Don't worry about asking the right question, just ask. Our world is full of challenges, and the best way to develop problem-solving skills is to ask questions and break through the status quo. Engage with your faculty. They have dedicated their life's work to sharing their passion and expertise in their field. They want to help you to learn and discover new ideas. Third, develop your network. Look around today. Your classmates will become your friends and colleagues. Get to know each other. Learn about their life experiences, look for ways to collaborate, and add to the richness of your shared Hofstra journey. You are now a part of the Pride, with over 140,000 strong alumni, including me. Take advantage of the opportunities to engage with them. You will meet them as guest speakers. They will be mentors and career advisors. Leverage your shared Hofstra experience and begin to develop a strong network. Fourth, and this may sound a little bit like an oxymoron, but fail well. Many of the best ideas are generated from failure, but the key lies in the way you react to failure, because that is what drives its usefulness. Failure is an opportunity to learn. Don't be afraid to understand what led to your mistake and own your part in it. It is through self-awareness that you will be able to take the lessons learned from that failure and apply them to moving forward. And finally, have a bias towards action. Be engaged. Don't sit on the sidelines. Get involved. Be active. Stir debate. Knowledge is important, but what you do with it is what will make you a Hofstra world changer. And so, on behalf of your faculty, your department chairs, and all your deans, I welcome you to our community of learners. Please always remember we are here to help, and we are all invested in your success. I wish you all the best as you begin your Hofstra journey, and I look forward to watching you achieve the goals that you have set for yourself. Welcome again, class of 2025. We are thrilled to have you with us.
Before we move on, I have a brief announcement. If there are any transfer students interested in attending the transfer meet and greet, please rise and quietly follow the Welcome Week leaders through the back of the auditorium. I want to thank Dr. Lanahan for those inspiring remarks and for the excellent advice. I know all of you will do very well to follow all of her tips. Now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is our signature speaker for the class of 2025 Common Reading, the 1619 Project. Dr. Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and Director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project at Harvard. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is a division of the New York Public Library, and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. Before leading the Schomburg Center, Dr. Muhammad was an associate professor at Indiana University. Dr. Muhammad's scholarship examines the broad intersections of racism, economic inequality, criminal justice, and democracy in US history. His writing and scholarship have been featured in national print and broadcast media outlets, such as The New Yorker, Washington Post, The Nation, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, Moyers and Company, MSNBC, and The New York Times, which includes his sugar essay for the 1619 Project. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including the recently released Amend, The Fight for America, the Oscar-nominated 13th, and Slavery by Another Name. Dr. Muhammad was an associate editor of the Journal of American History and an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Vera Institute of Justice. Dr. Muhammad received the Distinguished Service Medal from Columbia University's Teachers College, and he holds 2 honorary doctorates from the New School and from Bloomfield College. He is an award-winning teacher at Harvard and has received numerous honors from his commitment to public engagement. A native of Chicago's South Side, Dr. Muhammad graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics, and he earned his PhD in US History from Rutgers University. And now, Everyone, let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Muhammad.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real treat to be back on campus. This is my first in-person event in higher education since March 13th of 2020. I have not stepped foot on Harvard's campus, and so I have the great honor of making my way back into in-person experiences at Hofstra, and I'm very honored to be here today. I want to thank the interim provost, Janet Lanahan, and of course, Dr. Kristen Weingartner for receiving me this morning and hosting me, as well as Atheline Collins, who I will see for lunch in just a moment. What an exciting time in your lives. I know that you are going through orientation week. I've got two college kids of my own. One's a senior at Temple. The other is a sophomore at Northwestern. I remember being just like you many, many years ago. I was 17 years old in the fall of 1989 when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania. I actually still have a mental image of the orientation week and all the things that I participated in. And just to let you know that life is an amazing journey. You will never quite know what's around the corner, but you always have to put one foot ahead of the other. Just last night, I talked to both of my roommates from college, and one is celebrating his 50th this Friday, and the other celebrated just yesterday. And so we're getting old, but you all will get there too. And the great thing about college is you're going to meet people this week, next semester that will be lifelong friends. And so please cherish this experience. It's incredible. So I've got the job of helping to put in perhaps a broader context what you did in terms of this summer in the Common Reading. So the extent to which the 1619 Project was an invitation, was an invitation to reimagine American history in terms that I know as a young person in high school I didn't fully appreciate. And I can tell you as someone who's been a professor of history for almost 25 years, most of my students don't know when they show up in my classroom. And I want you to think about what you learned in that. So it may not be as clear to you what you didn't learn in high school because you're still young and your brains are still growing and they're still sponges. But I want to invite you to appreciate the context in which the 1619 Project helps us to really understand the fullness of American history and an ongoing, long-standing, and indeed enduring struggle for anti-racist democracy. So let's get started. So this is, of course, the magazine, and I understand at least last year folks got copies of it, and so I'm not sure that you did since we're almost 2 years out from it. But the lead editor, Nicole Hannah-Jones, put together a series of authors to write essays and creative writers to write poems. The point of the 1619 Project was to say, what if we got our history right by centering the fact of race and racism as foundational to America, rather than aberrational? Rather than something that was a bump on the road to American progress and greatness. That perhaps if we understood and faced with courage and honesty, that the story of America is also the story of peril alongside progress, of the bounty of prosperity as well as the challenge of exploitation. And that as much as Americans, one generation after the next, have sought a more perfect union, if we don't actually look at the road traveled, then we run the risk of running into dead ends. And that's what it's about. That's the context of the 1619 Project. And so when you look across the landscape of the work itself, you understand the limitations of our healthcare system. You understand that we are the world's greatest jailer. You understand that our health systems and what we eat are connected to commodities that have their roots in the transatlantic slave trade. You understand that the very concept of democracy, born in part of the abject reality of those who were enslaved. But there's another conceit that I want you to consider, and that is that perhaps we can't fully understand nor appreciate the country itself if we didn't understand this story of race and racism. Because, like I often say to my students, if a Martian showed up one day, say in 2025, and started to look around, they'd say, well, okay, I see in the museums of this nation the portraits of the founding fathers. I see the self-portrait or figurative art of people of European descent in art museums. And yet, as the demographics of the nation are so obviously changing, as I'm looking out at you, there are all these other people. Where did they come from? How did they get here? And how are we to explain that even in our national political culture, Black women are often positioned at the center of a national debate? Now, some of you are too young to have voted in the 2020 election, but maybe you were watching with your parents the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention. After all, we're all trapped in the midst of the pandemic. It was good political theater. And you might recall during the Republican National Convention, this woman, Alice Johnson. Alice Johnson, as noted here, was in prison on a drug conviction, part of the war on drugs, part of a moment that the nation itself is beginning to reconsider the excesses of a punitive focus on crimes that were, in many ways, at least now we have a better understanding officially, as a public health crisis. And so Donald Trump positioned Alice Johnson to be the face of a commercial showing his commitment to what's called the First Step Act, which was to roll back many of the harshest provisions in our federal system, including, if you can believe this, the shackling of pregnant women. But much of it was focused on nonviolent drug offenses, that is, to give people a second chance to get out sooner than they might otherwise have been based on laws that had been passed in the 1990s. And so here's Alice Johnson as part of Donald Trump's election campaign strategy to say that these are the good things he's doing. Of all the things that one could imagine, this is just one, and yet was prime time at the heart of the convention. And yet, in a primary race, you might have recalled in February of 2020, during the Super Bowl, Michael Bloomberg ran an ad featuring moms demanding action on gun violence. And as you'll note, two of the women featured in the front are Black women. And so this is neither Republican or Democrat. This is part of our national political culture. The idea that Michael Bloomberg, for example, spent $11 million on two Super Bowl ads, $5.5 million each. So we have to think about how is it the case that these Black women can be so central to the nation's political culture when Black people are only 13% of the population. You might recall, here's Joe Biden giving a shout out during his inaugural address to Ella Baker. Ella Baker, as he notes here, a giant of the civil rights movement, left us with this wisdom: give people light and they will find the way. Those are words for our time. This pattern of positioning, I apologize, I have two slides going here because I don't have a monitor. So if I'm talking about something you don't see it, someone raise a hand and give me a cue. So here is Michael Bloomberg, a screenshot of Michael Bloomberg's Super Bowl ad, and here is Joe Biden speaking. So here we have the commitment to framing a vision of American democracy with the bodies of Black women at the center of it. And yet, many of you may not know who Ella Baker was. Ella Baker was the godmother of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You also may not know what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is, but some of you, I'm sure, perhaps have heard of it. Anyone see the movie Selma a few years ago? Raise your hand. Good. So you know that that was a film that dramatized the voting rights movement and the effort in Alabama that began with this David versus Goliath battle over crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and a young John Lewis beaten nearly to death the first time around, ultimately culminated in a march to Montgomery that eventually led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Well, that John Lewis, who only passed a year ago, was mentored by this woman, Ella Baker, who was an organizer in the South, who opened NAACP chapters and then eventually helped to found SNCC in 1960. So when Joe Biden presents Ella Baker, this historical figure, he's saying that, like so many others, black women, as Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote in her essay, have been perfecters of democracy. And so whatever we might say in this moment, on this day, in the year 2021, about the greatness of this nation, partly what the 1619 Project invited us to do was to recognize that that greatness is shared, the inheritance is shared, the credit is due to people who've often been left out of our history books, out of how we've been socialized to understand this nation's history. And so I invite you to appreciate just for a moment that it is the unheralded, unknown, and often unseen people who labored in the plantations of our nation, in other homes as domestics. This is a black woman as an enslaved person, as a caretaker to this child. There are the black women whose bodies were literally used as raw material for medical and scientific investigation, and the work of the founder of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims. Some of you who are New Yorkers might even know or have been a participant in some protest a few years ago over a statue of J. Marion Sims in New York City that has since been removed. This is the first black woman of letters to be celebrated and heralded in the nation as an amazing writer and poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley in her first published novel in 1773. As a side note, when I ran the Schomburg Center in Harlem, how many of you have been to the Schomburg Center on a school field trip? Please tell me at least one person. Thank you. Thank you. The Schomburg is one of the oldest cultural institutions dedicated to global black history. And so I invite you, if you're not from New York or you come from far away, but even if you are from New York, to make sure before you graduate from Hofstra that you go to the Schomburg Center. In any case, we have a first edition of her novel, and it's a really special thing to hold it in one's hand. This is Sojourner Truth, the great activist who fought for women's suffrage alongside Susan B. Anthony, and many, many others. And so even the idea that this is not just a story of race and racism, because often the story of what black people were doing or attempted to do opened doors for others, helped to make possible the kinds of freedoms that many of us embrace, like marriage equality, or the fact that our borders since 1965 have been much more expansive, welcoming people from Asia that had been previously excluded in the 1880s. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, or for people from Africa who had been excluded by dint of not being of European heritage. Since 1965, so many people of color from around the world have been welcomed in the nation, partly a consequence of the struggles of African Americans during the Civil Rights era. This is Harriet Tubman, whose story has been dramatized and perhaps is one of the better known figures who gets a shout out during Black History Month. And this, unlike Harriet Tubman, is a woman named Ella Watson. In some ways, this is more like the mundane face of the essential workers of the early 20th century. Ella Watson worked in a Farm Securities Administration office in Washington, D.C., photographed here by the great photographer Gordon Parks. Anyone ever heard the name Gordon Parks? Wonderful. Anyone ever seen the remake of Shaft with Samuel Jackson? Okay, well, the original, which is now 50 years old, was released in 1971 and was made by Gordon Parks. Anyway, at the beginning of his career, he took this picture for Life magazine. And it's a memorable and iconic photograph of Gordon Parks precisely because it centers this black woman who is in the foreground in front of an American flag. And her heroism is not captured because she has just saved someone's life on a battlefield, but in fact because of her commitment to contributing to the greatness of the nation, in this case as a custodian in a federal office. He wanted to suggest to us that these are the people who make this nation work. And of course, there really were black women on the battlefields of the nation. These are black women serving in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And of course, to come full circle in this brief journey is, if I had a prize to give, I would reward someone. But if someone could shout out who the woman in the foreground is, I would be really impressed. She's still alive. Let's hear it. Be brave. This is your first moment. You're going to go into these classes. I'm going to take you at your word that you actually know and you're having a brain hiccup. Fisk University, Nashville, Tennessee. Her initials are DN. So that's okay. Diane Nash. You're going places, young man. Because whether you knew the answer or not, that's the right response. Take notes, everyone. Yes, Diane Nash. And C.T. Vivian, which would be a harder person to guess, is to her right. He also just passed within the same week, about a year ago, as John Lewis. And so you might have heard a lot of the controversy over critical race theory and efforts to pass bills that you can't teach the 1619 Project in class, but I want to suggest to you as a provocation that if you couldn't teach the 1619 Project because it's anti-American or it's divisive or it inserts race where race doesn't belong, then pretty much everything I've said so far in some states would be illegal if we were in a secondary public high school. But we're in college where the rules of academic freedom protect our ability to engage in a conversation. You don't have to believe everything that I'm saying. You can check for yourself. In fact, that's the great thing about college. You learn the skills to check for yourself. And so I would like to believe that just this very brief journey of these black women as perfecters of democracy, we actually, one, know a bit more than we knew before the moment we walked in here. And two, we have a greater appreciation that this just isn't about words on paper, about what the Declaration of Independence said or the Constitution said. Because I think all of us know that as great as the ideas were on paper, they weren't a reality. And so people fought for those realities. People struggled for those realities. And indeed, that struggle continues. This is LaTosha Brown, who was a colleague of mine at Harvard Kennedy School, who started an organization called Black Voters Matter. And at her essence, she's fighting for making sure that as many people get to vote as possible, period. That's what democracy ought to be about. We ought to want as many people as possible to vote. But I'm not here to make partisan claims. To me, this has nothing to do with her supporting the Democratic Party. This has to do with the history of the struggle for an anti-racist democracy. And in some ways, that's the history that starts on plantations. This is an image of a tour guide at the Whitney Museum. And the Whitney Museum is the nation's first and only museum dedicated to the history of sugar slavery. Anyone here from the South, for example, or happen to take a trip south at some point and go on a plantation tour of one kind or another? A few of you, yeah. And if I were to ask you to talk out loud, which I'm not, but if I were to ask you, I'd say, how much did you actually learn about the experience of the people who actually did the work on these plantations? Because most of these plantation tours are a celebration of a genteel Southern culture where we are to take note of the fine china and the architecture, the way that people lived in a grand style. Indeed, many of these plantations are rentals for elaborate weddings and other ceremonies of life. And it's not to say necessarily that that can't be true or that that's problematic, although it depends on one's perspective. But to silence the history of these places, to only imagine them as places of great wealth and leisure, of places that represent the height of Southern culture, is to contribute to the erasure of our actual history. And so I want to spend the bulk of my remaining time describing the stakes of this history, and indeed telling an origin story that I think is really important so that we can fully capture what it is that might invite us to realize, finally, in the United States of America, the actual democracy that went on paper in 1776 and was constitutionally ratified in 1790. Before the Europeans arrived, all of the land that the Whitney Plantation sits on was home to the Tensa Indians. German farmers began arriving in 1719, after which the area was called the German Coast, because unlike most of the earliest colonial settlers to Louisiana, where the Whitney Museum plantation is, these particular newcomers were not French. The Whitney Plantation was built in 1752, and from its rich soil, enslaved Africans, many of whom were from Senegambia, cultivated corn, indigo, and rice until sugar took root at the turn of the 19th century. The Whitney Plantation then operated continuously until 1975. Today it is a museum, but unlike many plantation museums in the South, this one is designed to tell a different story. This one tells the story not to glorify a story of putatively genteel masters and mistresses, but to educate visitors and offer them a chance to bear witness to exploitation and extraction that are foundational not just to the United States, but to the modern world. What little Americans are taught or think they know about slavery-based economies are largely a success story here, of course, of cotton and how it became the nation's leading export in the 19th century. Some people might also think of tobacco as a cash crop, worked by enslaved people in places like Virginia in earlier eras. But even though cotton and tobacco dominated the colonial American economy, it was sugar that anchored the economy of the larger Atlantic world. From the 16th century onward, even before 1619, it was sugar that was uniquely profitable as well as uniquely destructive and deadly. And yet none of this was foreordained or even predictable. For thousands of years, sugarcane was a heavy and unwieldy crop to be cut by hand and immediately ground to release the juice inside. Otherwise, it would spoil if left unattended within a day or two. And yet to achieve scale for export and trade, to lay the groundwork for a global economy that would eventually evolve into capitalism, sugarcane required tremendous coerced and coordinated human labor in warm climates and on fertile land. And it was Christopher Columbus who, on his second voyage across the Atlantic, brought with him sugarcane stalks in 1493. By then, Spain and Portugal had already been putting enslaved Africans to work growing sugarcane on the Atlantic islands off the coast of North Africa. And the potential for this industry to grow like gangbusters was why Columbus brought them to the so-called New World. And over the next 2 centuries on the sugar islands of the Greater Antilles, and I'll just fast forward here, in the Caribbean from Saint Domingue, which would eventually be home to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, to Cuba and Puerto Rico, to the Latin American countries of Mexico and South American of Brazil, European powers ultimately settled and colonized this part of the globe. By the mid-17th century, in an established Atlantic world, the British would then finally, as latecomers, stake a claim to the sugar islands of Barbados and Jamaica and the North American colonies. Soon they came to dominate the international slave trade too. And although England first established trading posts for acquiring gold and ivory along a span of 5,000 coastal Atlantic miles from present-day Morocco to South Africa, by 1672, King Charles II had conferred a monopoly on what was called the Royal African Company, specifically for the slave trade. The company used military personnel, government agents, and private investment capital garnered by selling stocks to merchants to build the single most successful transatlantic slave trading institution in history. Now, I pause on that because depending on the context, and most certainly was true then, this was a reason to celebrate. Kind of like Amazon's latest stock value, if you happen to be an investor in Amazon. But as you well know, the underside of Amazon is, of course, the struggle of the workers who make it possible to put all those little packages together so that they can get to you on a moment's notice. And so part of the story here is to figure out that if we don't learn about these histories, then we're not probably as well equipped to measure our own choices in the present. Because the more we know about this particular history, the more we understand how truly brutal this system was. Ships traveled a sea route that in its simplest form resembled an isosceles triangle. Here is the ship Brooks, which left the port of the coast of Ghana, here at El Mina, and traveled across the Atlantic where the literal cargo were human beings, and traveled along routes that represented or at least appeared like an isosceles triangle. The voyage typically started with Royal African ships departing from Bristol and Liverpool or London, heading to Africa carrying guns, iron bars, fetters, glass beads, clothes, and copper pots to trade for people. Those ships would arrive, for example, in Cape Castle, which we just saw an image of in Ghana, Britain's West African slaving capital. This became known as the Middle Passage, since it was the middle leg of the route. Arriving in Barbados or Jamaica, the ships would exchange people for sugar, molasses, and lumber. From there, they would return home to England, completing the last part of the triangle. Other forms of this triangular route existed, with stops to North American colonies to load rice, tobacco, flour, and rum, but the crucial leg was, in fact, the Middle Passage. This was the means of bringing estimated 12.1 million people from Africa to the New World. About 1.5 million are estimated to have perished, either due to disease, murder, or drowning along the way. About 10 million landed in South America, most of whom landed in Brazil, and the remaining roughly 600,000 or so landed in the North American colonies, with the West Indies filling in the part of the 10 million. Without African lives as the human raw materials in the making of sugar, along with other wealth-producing plantation commodities, the distribution of Atlantic peoples and the wealth of the world would likely be very different today. From finance to finished goods, the transatlantic trade spawned a dizzying array of British businesses manufacturing ships and armaments, glass and iron, linens and pottery, distilling beer and rum, which would be sold in Africa, the West Indies, and North America. To quote a London merchant at the time, in 1745, he had this to say: "Are we not indebted to that valuable people, the Africans, for our sugars, tobaccos, rice, rum, and all the other plantation produce? The more Negroes imported," he wrote, the more Negroes we imported, he wrote, the more British goods were made and exported for trade. The Negro trade, he described was the foundation, in his own words, an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power to this nation. His report was backed by lots of evidence, as historians have noted, and indeed in Bristol, England, a local observer, a British man writing in a journal noted, quote, "There is not a brick in this city but what is cemented with the blood of a slave." The voracious appetite for wealth creation and the unyielding desire for sugar combined to create the foundation of our modern world. From the time the Royal African Company slavers set sail for North America through the years of the American Revolution until the abolition of the international slave trade in 1807, 3 million souls, those are just those counted, brought by the British, would be forcibly removed from their homes, their kin, and their way of life. The majority of them to feed demand for a sweetener. Countless fortunes were made in Liverpool, that is, back in England. The Martins Bank building opened in 1932, which happens to be the former home of Barclays Bank, which is actually the same bank whose name is on the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, where the Brooklyn Nets play. This bank opened in 1932 and memorialized the role of all banks in financing the Atlantic slave trade with a sculpture of 2 African boys fettered about the neck and ankles and holding bags of money. So there was no secret to any of this. There's no shame. This was how the world worked. Now, when I say there's no shame, does not mean there was no condemnation for those who opposed slavery, both those who were enslaved as well as anti-slavery activists who were around from the very beginning. The slave trade was complex and evolved out of existing networks of exchange that also included captured people among Africans themselves. Before European slavers arrived, African chiefs and merchants were already trading among themselves along well-established routes from west to east, from the Saharan north to the sub-Saharan south. In addition to trading palm cloth, copper, jewelry, ivory, cutlery, wood, and musical instruments, merchants would exchange enslaved people, captured in wars or village raids. Except African elites did not typically sell their own kin. Captives tended to be culturally and ethnically alien to those who enslaved them. About half the captives were prisoners of war, another third were labeled as criminals and undesirables or outcasts and treated with disdain, similar to how the English regarded indentured servants forcibly removed to North America or to Australia. I'm going to pause just briefly on this point because this is an important note. Africa is home to dozens of countries and hundreds of ethnicities, different languages, and communities, just as is true of Europe, Asia, South America. North America is exceptional since the 16th century because it is really home to Canada and the United States once the conquest and genocide of the indigenous people took place. But before the Europeans arrived, it was home to many, many, many ethnicities and tribes and clans of indigenous people. So when one describes a system of servitude that existed in Africa, one is describing people who did not see themselves as kin any more than the French and the English saw themselves as they fought multiple wars in the 15th, 16th centuries. So we have to keep that in mind because even though that is part of the history and it's an important part of the history, it doesn't mean, therefore, that Africans simply traded in slavery just like everybody else, and therefore the United States has no particular relationship to this history. Because what they were doing here looked very different than what happened on the other side. Let me share a little bit about what that looked like. Kidnapping, it is estimated, occurred anywhere between 20% and 70% of those who were brought to the New World. What did it mean to be kidnapped? From the perspective of the many men, women, and children who were put in the holds of slave vessels, the technical definition of kidnapping was a difference without distinction. Few non-elites were spared from this business. One example recorded in the testimony given to British Parliament's House of Commons in the 1700s gives a sense of the violence of the enterprise. Off the coast of Bonny Point in present-day Nigeria, a young woman was grabbed by two men who, quote, secured her hands behind her back, beat her, and ill-used her on account of the resistance she made. This was according to an enslaver named John Douglas, who was giving testimony to the British House of Commons. After being captured or sold, individuals were dragged to barracks where they often lived for months. Some of them died in those barracks before they were loaded onto ships, one batch of bodies at a time. And to go back to what the ships looked like. This phase of the Middle Passage, some historians have described as the human manufacturing process. And it lasted, that is, the travel from the coast of Africa to either South America, the Caribbean, or to North American colonies, lasted anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks, hundreds of captives on board. Who was on board? Strong, healthy men in their prime between 15 and 25 years old made up the bulk of those who were enslaved at sea. Ship captains aimed for a 2-to-1 ratio of men to women with a small percentage of boys and girls. Traders judged women's fitness by their reproductive potential. In the House of Lords records of certificates, these are the primary sources used by historians to describe what is happening. One merchant recorded, quote, the women in general having good breasts were strong and well, end quote. Slavery at sea, as historians long have written, brought terrors to the captives beyond our worst nightmares. The extreme challenges of food preservation and water rationing made the transoceanic journey itself treacherous. But the economics of the trade and financial incentives for captains and ship surgeons conspired to keep alive as many captives as possible. But there were limits, starting with space. The surgeon, it may surprise you, they were called surgeons, these doctors, because each human life was a life that was an economic investment to be sold on the other side. The idea was to get people there alive so that they could work on sugar plantations. And so this surgeon described conditions aboard his ship where captains, quote, had not so much room as a man in his coffin, neither in length or breadth, and it was impossible for them to turn or shift with any ease. Captain John Ashley testified before the members of the House of Commons that he frequently heard them crying out when below for the want of air, suffocating as if buried alive. With human waste uncontainable, men were shackled side by side as metal and iron tore into flesh with every jolt of the ocean. One historian found a report in the archives of several men on the ship Venus who died from, and I quote, part of the scrotum torn off with their irons. Slave crews typically separated men from women, leaving women in their own quarters, unchained and unprotected, all the easier for sailors to rape them. John Newton, a slave trader turned abolitionist who wrote the hymn, I'd be really impressed if you guys know which hymn it is, Amazing Grace, described this in his memoir. They are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. Now again, in a context where we have intense partisan debates about how we should talk about our history, I am reading the words of the author of the song Amazing Grace in his own testimony. So these are his words, his witness, his testimony. Described in his memoir, quote, they are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. Another ship's crew referred to the area where women were held as the, quote, whore hole. Instances of sexual violation on these voyages are impossible to count definitively, but from ship logs, journals, and testimonies, it is evident that they were numerous. On the British vessel African in 1753, a man named William Cooney raped a pregnant woman. She was listed in the log as, quote, number 83, following a common practice for a kind of dead naming of captives. He took her into the room and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarter deck. In these moments, slave traders were conditioning Africans for plantation slavery. But the captives were also forming a new identity, a diasporic blackness forged out of their collective fate as they found strength in each other with every miserable day that passed. Uprisings of captives at sea were rare, but were the most spectacular instances of collective resistance. A 1731 insurrection involved 140 Africans. They killed most of the crew and escaped with the ship. Much more frequent acts of resistance took the form of recalcitrance, a refusal by captives to eat or to exercise. They plotted conspiracies to poison the crew's food and beverage, and they also took complete control of their individual bodies and minds when they sought freedom in another realm. The surgeon, Isaac Wilson, again, the surgeons were the doctors on the ships to keep everyone alive. The surgeon, Isaac Wilson, recalled a man who threw himself into the sea and seemed to relish his own drowning. And I quote, "He went down as if exulting that he got away." This story of the transatlantic slave trade brings us to the doorstep of this country and brings us quite close, actually, to the infrastructure that we live amongst today. This is the Rhinelander Sugar House, which was a sugar refinery on the east side of Manhattan, part of the place where 1 and 2 ships arriving in the East Harbor were carrying either enslaved people or sugar. And while this building itself no longer exists, it is meaningful in 2 ways. One, it was amongst the tallest structures in early 18th century Manhattan. This image dates back to the mid-1700s. The only other building taller was Trinity Church, whose steeple was the tallest along the lower Manhattan skyline. Today it is home, as you note from the caption, the land upon it rests of the New York Police Department. The work of enslaved people was quite taxing in difficulty, was much more factory-like because it required moving the sugar from the field into a mill in order to grind the plant to extract the juice, which went through a series of processes of boiling the juice that would eventually create sugar crystals that would over time be refined into table sugar that we have today. This system spared no one. This is an image of young children working in sugarcane fields. This image dates to the 1880s, and in part because photography itself was not really available until the 1850s. African Americans, however, fought both on their way to the New World as well as in the fields themselves. And one of the greatest uprisings in the nation's history occurred in 1811 when anywhere from 100 to 200 Black people in southern Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans, banded together as a liberation army and attempted to march to New Orleans to free the city itself. Within a day, they were captured, 100 of whom were beheaded, and a museum today shows in this installation the leader, a man named Charles Deslan, who's featured here, was part of the telling of this history because unlike the Nat Turner Rebellion, which took place literally 20 years later, this one was much larger. And that's an important point. It's been redacted from American history. It's not clear. No one can explain fully why it's been redacted from American history. One speculation is that the potential threat of this particular liberation army was so substantial that required federal militia to put the enslaved down, that if they had talked about it, it might have inspired other insurrections far earlier than what happened in 1831 in Virginia with Nat Turner's rebellion. And so the story of slavery is as much the story of our own popular memory and national memory. I've tried to describe here in somewhat brief fashion based on the work that I wrote in the 1619 Project, but in a broader context of other work within that project, that it's impossible for us to fully understand the nation we live in and what we are capable of if we are to live up to our best selves without understanding this history. This is an image of one of my best friends who I went to graduate school with on the right. His name is Matt Cottrell. He's a professor at Brown. You might read some of his work while you're here at Hofstra. And on the left is his son. They happen to be looking at a series of images from the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and off to the right here are a series of routes. Has anyone ever been to the New Bedford Whaling Museum? Excellent. It's an amazing museum. It tells the story of whaling, which was one of America's largest export industries before we got into cotton. Whaling was so successful that Herman Melville wrote a book about it called Moby Dick. The industry itself is captured here in its history, but the interesting footnote here, and it's not a footnote at all in truth, is when whaling died, it was replaced by textile manufacturing. And so many of you who may be from New England certainly understand the history of textile manufacturing is also the history of cotton. And so in this museum, there's no story of slavery. Slavery is completely redacted from this museum, but there is a gigantic bale of cotton. And you can see it in this image right here. It's not so clear, but that's it. And so what does it mean that today, and this image was taken about 4 years ago, that my family and close friend were at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and a bale of cotton is in the middle of the room, and there's no story of how it really got there. And that's, I think, why the 1619 Project is so important, because the story of New Bedford is also the story of Wamsutta Mills, which is ultimately the story of the country we live in today. Anyone ever sleep on Wamsutta sheets? Raise your hand. And if you haven't, go home and double check, or the next time you're at home. You can buy them at Bed Bath & Beyond. It's a very popular brand. And of course, we're all wearing cotton somewhere on our bodies today. A lot more polyester these days. It's made a comeback. And that's not as much a joke to you because you're young, but those backstage certainly appreciate the polyester joke. In any case, this is the world we live in. And so if we can't appreciate what this means to us, then we are doomed potentially to make similar mistakes. I'm going to move through this story much faster than I had intended because I want to get to the final reflection. Cotton ultimately replaced sugar in the United States. Sugar got a lot of Europeans to the New World, but ultimately by the 19th century, as noted here by this image of the cotton gins, Patton, ultimately made America a very wealthy nation early on. And so our cotton production went from 9% to 75%. It is estimated that 1 in 65 people were employed in the cotton manufacturing trade. And of course, the notion of buying and selling human beings here in the United States was not something that was deemed immoral by many people. It was deemed immoral by those who fought against it, who were anti-slavery or abolitionists, kind of crazy, radical people who had a notion that this was just wrong and we ought to do something about it. And yet, if we really appreciate the footprint, then we'll recognize that a place even like New Orleans was a slave trading capital of the United States. You could go there and buy and sell. It was, I liken it in my article to the Walmart of people selling. It was that big and important. And this is an image from inside of the St. Louis Hotel where in this open space, people were simply bought and sold as a kind of commodity exchange. And what's so powerful about that is that this building, its bones are the Omni Royal New Orleans today. Anyone ever stay here? And if you've been to New Orleans, I'm sure you've walked by it or seen it. It's this same building today where that all happened. And yet, you have to literally go inside of the website, multiple pages inside, to find a couple of vague and veiled references to what happened here. Now, if you happen to go to Berlin in Germany, for example, you can't miss the fact that Jews were systematically murdered and removed from their homes in the capital of that nation. And yet here, in so many ways, everything that helps to explain the country we actually live in today, there's very little that you can see and touch and feel that tells us that history, that might actually make it so that we're not fighting over who gets to vote and what hour of the day right now in the United States. So this is a Google Maps image of where the hotel is. It's the red dot, as you will recognize. And I just want to point out that this is the mighty Mississippi River, and along this river, if we were to follow it, would eventually get us to the Whitney plantation. But if we go in the opposite direction, we get to the home of the Domino sugar refinery today, which is technically in Araby, Louisiana. And it is the largest refinery in the United States of America today. It happens to sit kind of a stone's throw away from the lower Ninth Ward. And you might remember the lower Ninth Ward as very young people as the site of the devastation and death of Hurricane Katrina, of which New Orleans is off to the side here. And images of black people whose homes were built on the lowest lying land, who were dependent upon levees that were poorly built and maintained, and ultimately cost many of them their lives and their livelihood. And this is what those homes look like, many of which were rebuilt. And yet, this home today looks eerily familiar to the homes of enslaved Africans who worked in Louisiana many years ago. And this is one of those structures still standing. This is the museum's own version of an original enslaved quarter. That's inside of it. And these are visitors today, and that's the tour guide I showed you earlier holding her cell phone out. Now, I happened to be there when I was doing reporting, and if you've read my essay, you know that I visited. What was so fascinating about this moment was that she was showing an image on her cell phone of one of her own relatives who lived on that plantation in the 1960s, working as a sugar worker. This is an ancient history, folks. The 1619 projects and the stories that are told there are not ancient history. These are stories of who we are. These are stories of America. These are stories of the importance of slavery's capitalism and building the wealth of a nation that far surpassed any other industry in America when we look at the value of enslaved lives at the time of the Civil War. And so I'm going to close not with the coda that I had intended, which was about the continuation of exploitation. I'm going to close ultimately with the choices that we still face. I'm going to close with the choices that we still have about who bears the burden to fight for an anti-racist democracy. Because as you noted as I moved through those handful of slides, we still have a nation of unfreedom. We lock up more people than anywhere in the world in the name of punishment, but what it really is the name of inequality. America has a profound inequality problem rooted in racism and structural disadvantages that we have yet to come to terms with. And we've solved those problems with the mantra of law and order and tough on crime and built as many cages as we could to put as many people behind them. And yet those who would help to lead us to a different future are no different than this young woman on the streets of Ferguson just a few years ago. And certainly not unlike so many who took to the streets in the middle of a Black Lives Matter protest that numbered anywhere from 15 million to 26 million in the streets of the United States just last summer. Just last summer. And so the choice is still ours to make of which side of history are we going to write about and learn about and lean into. Because at the end of the day, as much as Alice Johnson is entitled to her choice and her agency, her ability to pick and choose who her political representation is going to be, and here she's obviously supporting Donald Trump and Mike Pence in their campaign for the presidency a year ago, it is true that these are not neutral stakes. Because shortly after that convention and the election, we had an insurrection on the Capitol. And it wasn't led by Black Lives Matter activists. It was led by the president's, former president's supporters. Not all of them, let's even say a small number, but it happened. And for the first time in American history, the Confederate flag flew in the United States Capitol. Hadn't happened before, hadn't happened during the Civil War, but it happened on January 6th of 2020. So where we are today, I think, speaks to the importance of the 1619 Project, not simply as a common reading for our own understanding, but a call to our own political citizenship, to be part of something bigger than ourselves, to be part of institutions that have the capacity to help us to grow and to evolve, and to be the stewards of our history in ways that help us shape a better future. Thank you. So I will take a few questions, and I'll get my cue from backstage when we should stop. I know we don't have quite as much time as we'd hoped, but the mics are up front. They're hot. Excited to hear a question. I will say this. I don't mind if you just want to make a comment because you had a thought and you wanted to share it. It's okay with me. But pick that or a question. And I'll give you a little tip. So since you're freshmen and you're starting college, when you start class on Wednesday and the professor says, hey, does anybody have a reflection on this week's reading? Those are the easy questions to answer. Questions only get harder because then you have to actually have done the reading and know something specific. So you, brave sir, you've got the floor.
Yeah, this isn't a question, more of just a comment. I live in Massachusetts, and I've taken field trips to textile mills. And, like, there was a lot of stuff about workers, but it was all, like, the workers in the textile mills. And, like, I mean, obviously the connection was there, but it was never, like, I still hadn't made it to, like, you know, plantations and cotton farms. So, you know, it was surprising to me how, like, hidden it was.
Yeah,
or, like,
yeah.
not apparent it was.
I really appreciate that comment, and I think that is the point, right?
Yeah.
We should know how these things came to be. And as much as we can't live without cotton, to be frank, we could have built a different system to produce it. Mm-hmm. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I'll alternate. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Hello. I'm going to take this out. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just want to say that also. And also, I don't exactly know how I want to phrase this question, so please forgive my ineloquency. When looking back on slavery, a lot of like the racist institutions that were upheld like out of greed fueled by racism. And today we see racism, like racist policies and like institutions that are still in place, like opposition to teaching critical race theory. So in your like professional opinion, what kind of motivations that are fueled by racism, like what are people trying to like profit from trying to keep people like uneducated about the systems that built our nation, like in a like the racist like unequal systems that built this nation?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and I'm going to answer that question. Really great question. Just be mindful. You don't have to touch the mics. Just move closer to it. That way we keep the touchy COVID transmission down. So thank you. So you asked about motivation. It's a really great question because sometimes it seems so obvious, but yet it bears further scrutiny. I'll say this quickly. So you already mentioned the word greed. I mean, no one got on a ship and took the chance to die along the way, but for the pursuit of their own economic interests. Except some people didn't have a choice. So I think whether we use an economic argument as the primary motivation to create the world that came to be in the 17th century, I think that's perfectly fine, and that's the right answer. But you're asking a question about today, and the degree to which we assume that greed is not driving the kind of racist division, I think is partly why we feel uncomfortable with history. Because we have a country where there is more inequality right now than there was 100 years ago during the Gilded Age. We have people self-financing space exploration. And while that's really cool, like literally in the cool sense, it is representative of the fact that there is so much wealth held by individuals that it threatens really democracy in the way that it should be. philosophers have long written about the corruption of extreme wealth. This is what monarchies were all about. So I'm not convinced that we're past the greed motivation. The question is, why would people who are not wealthy go along with it? And in that sense, I suggest that we are socialized to admire wealth, to all want to be wealthy. And so we're picking sides with winners without making different choices that might actually make for a healthier society for everyone. I'll have to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hello. Sorry, I lost my voice last night, but so right now, in the world, in the society we live in, we popularize the injustice and racism and slavery of the Black community and stuff like that in our past. However, nowadays, people largely ignore the problems going on in places such as China and the Philippines, where there's several, like the Uyghur situation right now, and there's modern day slavery where they ship people out and execute them.
Could you quiet? I know some of you are leaving. That's okay. Just do it quietly, please.
And right now, there's no light on, many people do not know about the situation down there, and it's really disgusting what they're doing to the Chinese and other racial, Asian countries, and it's absurd. But how do you get more light and show the world and get more people activated in these things?
Yeah, so the question is about the Uyghur situation and other persecuted ethnic groups, particularly in China. It's a great question, and he's absolutely right. I think time is up, but I will answer this question, and then we'll play it by ear with anyone else. Okay. With the situation of human rights abuses and human trafficking that still exists in the world, part of what every nation has the responsibility for doing is understanding its own role in the maldistribution of resources and power. And in the United States, as the wealthiest nation with the largest military, if we are still struggling with getting our history right, we're not in a good position to be able to speak to and or do what's necessary to help other people around the world. So part of it is incumbent upon you as college students to take advantage of the next 4 years to figure out how you want to make a difference in the world based on leaning into some of these subject areas and histories and philosophies that often have been marginalized within the academy itself. Thank you for the question and for the expression of concern. Yes?
Hello. So my question is just quickly, I want to know, what is the real distinction between, I remember you were mentioning the, what is it called? Indentured servants in early American history, colonial American history, who were mainly Germans, Irish, Scottish, so on and so forth. What was the distinction between them economically, between them and slaves? Because there's obviously the racial aspect, but what beyond that?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, what was the difference between an indentured servant as a person from England and Scotland or Ireland, and versus those who were brought here as enslaved Africans? It's a great question, requires a little bit of nuance. So in the very beginning, if 1619 is the proverbial beginning, it's not the actual beginning. There was slavery amongst the Spanish colonizers of Florida and parts of what was once Mexico in North America. And there's some question about the way that the Spanish enslaved people was more fluent, less harsh than would be the case for British. But in the comparison, starting with 1619 as the origins date for 20 or 30 captives of African descent to arrive in Jamestown, Virginia, there was very little meaningful distinction in the earliest days. It's not even clear what exactly was their experience. All we know is that over time, those distinctions became hardened, and they were pretty much set in stone by the end of the 1600s. There are a number of things that take place: legal disputes, cases of interracial relationships that produce children, and what would the child be defined as? Would it carry the freedom of the father or the servitude or slavery, enslavement of the mother? So laws were passed beginning in the late 1600s that essentially were called slave codes or Negro Acts that give us the evidence for the actual legal distinctions that were evolving over time. The last thing I'll say on this, because it's a great question, but it's a lot of history to explain it, is that sometime before the 17th century, the legal question of the status of a child of an interracial union created for the first time in history matrilineal descent, so that the status of the child followed the status of the mother in perpetuity. This, of course, solved an obvious problem, which was that a mixed race of children who could claim freedom would upset the ease with which blackness became a marker of servitude. It was harder to know who was an indentured servant versus who was a property owner, but it was much easier to know who was a slave and who was free. And then the last thing, the children of these often rapes were themselves assets on the books of the men who were their fathers. And that also meant that men could create wealth for themselves simply by raping the women who they owned. And all of this created differences that were not insignificant relative to what forms of servitude existed in other parts of the world before this moment, and particularly in Africa, where some people will say, because Africans engaged in forms of servitude, what's the difference? You know, let's not blame white Americans, for example. Thank you for the question. Yes?
Firstly, good morning. Secondly, this is more of a statement rather than a question. But I really enjoyed the presentation, but at the same time, it was really frustrating to sit through because I'm Jamaican, and I've literally been learning about all of these things from I was younger than 10. So to know that a country that still greatly benefits from all of the things that happened in the past completely either whitewashes or ignores these parts of history, it was really frustrating to see, because you hear conversations where people are like, oh, this isn't about race, stop bringing it up. And it's like, yes, it is, because racism is kind of a foundation, in a sense, of this country. So I'd just like to say I really appreciate you coming and talking about this. And it's appalling that people are trying to like make it illegal to stop the education of these kind of things. And I also appreciate Hofstra for allowing you to come and talk about this.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Shout out to Hofstra. I'm going to take my cues from you, so you let me know. Okay. Yes.
Alrighty, so hopefully I articulated like this question correctly and you understand. So
Okay.
this is like about the process of dehumanizations of Africans in the like at the start of the slave trade, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how exactly did the process went? Because I'm pretty sure that if you're gonna dehumanize another race, you have to dehumanize everyone else besides your own race first. So how did this happen?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, there must have been something missing in the moral compass of the enslavers to do what they did to the enslaved. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it's more like how did it happen? Like, is it like how did it start? Like maybe because like the association like slavery with the object stuff. Because again.
Okay, so there's, of course, history is, there's always a backstory, right?
Yep,
Until we
all the
get to
time.
like, you know, that moment of the beginning, or however it might be defined, you know, like the anthropoid who, you know, walks on two legs and has opposable thumbs, or a Garden of Eden, whatever it is, there's always, you know, until we get to that moment. So the backstory is that with sugar slavery, there was already Arabs enslaving North Africans in the Mediterranean, which were providing sugar to Europeans, except it was so expensive and it was at a smaller scale of production that only very wealthy aristocrats could afford sugar. And even before that, in New Guinea and parts of India, sugar was being cultivated, but again, it was mostly the purview of elites. So part of the origin story that I'm telling here is the moment when there's so much money to be made from sugar that Europeans literally decide to go on the other side of the world, which had not been the case, in search of profit born of sugar cultivation. So the short answer to your question is, how did it happen? It was already happening. It just happened at a greater scale, and Africans happened to be the victims of this massive scale of production out of the circumstances of trade routes, literally how the wind blows, the proximity of North Africa to Southern Europe, so on and so forth.
In other words, that's what happens when you present humans as objects, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah, nice beard, by the way.
Say it again.
Nice beard.
Nice.
Beard.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, your speech was amazing. I have to. So you mentioned a lot about teaching this stuff in school, and there's a lot of people like trying to suppress anti-racism in schools. Why do you think that is, and how can we make them stop us? How can we get people to get this in schools, essentially?
Yeah. So the young woman who thanked Hofstra a few moments ago, who expressed frustration with, everyone has a mask on, so I apologize, it's hard to see who's who, but who expressed frustration with having learned this as a young person and still hearing people define it as, okay, or it's not really about that, is exactly the stakes that we're talking about here. The backlash is against the possibility that what happened last summer when 15 to 25 million people, most of whom were white people, in communities sometimes where there were few Asians, Latinx people, or black people to speak of, looked at the killing of George Floyd and the callousness with which Derek Chauvin and two other officers killed him, although the other officers haven't been convicted, as finally the tipping point that something is terribly wrong. Of course, that came on the heels of the Central Park bird watcher, when a white woman called the cops on him and basically cried rape, which could have led to his killing if the cops showed up and they were like, this woman called, said she's being raped, there you are, bang, bang.
That guy was also like a really important in he was a Marvel editor, and he was responsible for bringing LGBTQ rap into comics. Yeah. He was a really good guy.
Yeah, but again, we live in a country where you shouldn't have to be a good guy to not be killed or have someone accused. The point being that the threat to there's no way for me to say this without losing someone. So let me put it, I'll say it, but then recognize that there's complexity here. The people who have been convicted, 300 of whom, who broke into the Capitol, committed acts of violence or threatened violence or carried the Confederate flag, whatever. Those people, let's just say those 300, who don't think the election was fair, think the election was stolen, and were willing to commit acts of violence against the nation and its elected leaders to do so, including a lynching, threatened lynching of Mike Pence, right? Those people don't want any more white Americans to learn any of this history in any context, lest they actually keep forcing America to change, period. And so we have the legacy of people who supported slavery, who supported segregation, who believe the flag, Confederate flag, is heritage and not hate, who have a very distorted view that the Confederacy was not about secession in defense of slavery, which every secession bill passed by Confederate states was. It's totally verifiable. So in the alternative fact realm of people who don't believe climate change is science-based, they unfortunately have enough political power in many states in this country to pass bills to say, we're not going to teach that stuff because that is a lie. Just like some of these same states don't allow people to learn about climate change. Just like 100 years ago, they didn't allow people to teach evolution. And so I don't know what to say about, I can't tell you the recipe for fixing that problem in the short term. What I can tell you is that being in college helps a whole lot. and getting opportunities for learning these histories in ways that are responsible helps a whole lot, but it doesn't solve all the problem, because at the end of the day, power is power, and people will do anything to hold on to it.
All right, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Last one? Yeah. I apologize. I'm gonna go here and then there, and that's it. So just two. Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. I guess I want to say my name is Donovan Ellis, and if the entire point of the 1619 project is to effectively shine a light on information about, black history in America and just how it's been covered up, I wanted to know if it were possible for the 1619 project to somewhat evolve later along the line to maybe also include the plights of other marginalized groups and other minorities. Because not to be that guy at all, I'm not trying to discount like everything that we have done or everything that's been done to us. But sometimes, especially in this year, and I'm not the best person to speak on this, but when I see just the violence on other marginalized groups like like Asians during the COVID, and when my mom would always talk about like Black history, I was always the type of person that's been like, okay, so almost everyone here can probably say when is Black History Month in America, right?
Yep.
But I found that less people could say something along the lines of Pacific Island, Asian and Pacific Heritage Month and Hispanic Month. So I've just wondered if it were possible for the 1619 project to evolve as time goes on, as we cover more stuff.
That's a great question. I think that's a wonderful suggestion. I'll mention it to Nicole. A book version of the original magazine is coming out. I think your larger question is less about whether the quote-unquote 1619 project will evolve and more about whether or not we can hold in our heads the multiple threads and complexities of differing groups and experiences they've had in this country. The short answer to that is yes. The longer answer is, do we have the political will to do so? Because just by way of example, if the 1619 project is now banned in maybe 11 states, the more expansive the story becomes about the struggle for full inclusion, the more likely their backlash is to be, exponentially greater. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And what I want to say on that is people at this university are trying, like my university are trying. The 1619 project became a cultural phenomenon which no one could have predicted. It was a magazine, a special issue of the magazine on the 400th anniversary of the first arrival of Africans in Jamestown. No one could have imagined it would have become this. So it is incumbent upon all of us to support the kind of academic and literary work that is required to tell those other stories, including myself. And that we don't have to wait for Nicole Hannah-Jones or the 1619 Project to get that work going. You have people on this campus who are doing that work already. So no but, more of, right?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And this probably isn't the best question to end on, but I took a film class last year. We had a lot of different movies talking about a lot of different topics. And we watched Lee Daniels' The Butler. Have you?
Yes.
I don't want to assume. Okay. What are your thoughts on that commentary of, going from slavery into working and still, in certain aspects, still not being seen, just, not being heard, but still working for the people in power?
I'm not sure the challenge of the question. Because Ella Watson is a version of the butler, right? The black woman whose forebears had been enslaved domestics and field workers, and now she's in a federal office pushing a broom, being essentially an essential worker as a second-class citizen of her nation.
Right.
But you're asking something else, I think.
I guess. What did you think of the movie? Like, what did you think of how it brought this thing to life?
So I will admit, I saw the movie. I had problems with it, and I saw it, and I read critical reviews. I don't remember enough about any of it right now to give an answer that I'm comfortable with. I will say that telling these histories through film and popular culture is difficult because there's often a trade-off between both nuance and accuracy, and what will get bodies to the movie theater to pay for a ticket. And I remember there were some errors of accuracy in the film. And I can't remember, if the character played by Forrest Whitaker himself was much more complicated than heroic in real life, which I think was the case. So I think we have to, to me, the broader question is not what I thought of the butler. I think the broader invitation here is that these histories don't have to be morality tales in order to help us understand where we've come from and where we need to go. There can be complexity where people are not, all victims in the sense that they don't make choices that might actually seem despicable to us, even as black people. Alice Johnson, the reason I open with her is because Trump has black supporters. There are black people who are fighting against the teaching of race and racism in schools. But that doesn't mean that it invalidates what I've shown. It just means you have a choice to make. Like, you might not have a choice, but we do live in an open society, and so you can choose to follow the Alice Johnsons of the world or others. It's up to you. But I just want to know that when you're making that choice, some of the history is not debatable, right? Some of what happened before is not debatable and ought to be known so that you can make an informed choice. And after all, that's what Orientation Week is about, to be inspired, to learn, to make choices in your classes, to figure out who you're going to be as an adult. I am really grateful to be here. Thank you all so much for sticking around.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad, for engaging all of us in these important conversations about the legacy of slavery on U.S. history. To our students in the audience, thank you for being here. We hope that you enjoy the rest of Welcome Week. Please remember the school socials are taking place today from 1 to 2 p.m. And please check the guidebook app for the locations for those socials. Thanks, everyone.